It's Wednesday, the 5th of February. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blancolirio channel. Breaking news out of Istanbul, Turkey. Yet another runway overrun on a Boeing 737-800 aircraft in only what I can describe as what appears to be a very grossly negligent runway overrun today. First, let's look at the raw video of the aftermath.
ATV varsa bir parat yok mu?
Asfalttan göndersene şey.
İnerken mi düştü? Nasıl düştü?
Abi demek kaymış. Kaygan. Bir de oradan pist
Oradan
yetmiyor abi.
pistten ağrı, şuradan uçmuş lan, şuradan ağrı bak. Orada millet oradan öyle uçmuş.
Bir de buranın pisti kısa abi, kısa.
Ya.
Arkadan beni aldı ben.
Ne atladığını gördüm ya.
Baba daha diyor uçağa gelsen görüyor uçağa.
Ben uyuyordum ya.
Uyuyor. Dünyadan haberi yok.
We'll talk more about the condition of the aircraft here in a second, but first let's get to the facts as we know them so far from Simon Radecki's site, the Aviation Herald. Accident Pegasus, Boeing 737-800 at Istanbul, February 5th, 2020, overran runway, impacted wall, and broke up. A Pegasus Boeing 737-800 registration Tango Charlie India Zulu Kilo performing flight as Pegasus 2193 from Izmir to Istanbul with 171 passengers and 6 crew landed on Sabiha Gökhan's runway 06 at 1820 local 1520Z. Runway 06 is about 9,800 feet long, but overran the end of the runway, impacting the runway perimeter wall and broke into 3 parts about 550 feet past the end of the runway, 170 meters. An engine that had separated caught fire. As the current rescue and recovery works are in progress, the engine fire was quickly extinguished. Istanbul's governor reported 52 people were taken to the hospital with injuries, including all 6 crew members. Remember, this is preliminary data. These numbers can change. According to Mode S data transmitted by the aircraft, the aircraft landed long and hot. That means he landed too far down the runway at too fast of a speed. 1,500 meters before the runway threshold, this is on the approach, the aircraft was descending through 950 feet MSL, mean sea level, or 661 feet above ground level. The airport elevation is about 312 feet. At 194 knots over the ground, much too fast. Now, a lot of this ground speed is made up for by the wind component, which we'll get to in a moment. Touched down about Abeam taxiways Tango at Foxtrot, which is 1,950 meters or 6,400 feet past the threshold, and about 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet before the end of the runway. Now, you're supposed to touch down in the first third of the runway, not the last 2/3 of the runway. He touched down at this point at about 130 knots ground speed, overran the end of the runway at about 63 knots, so he was still had a ground speed, or he was still rolling forward at 63 knots as he departed the end of the runway. Veering slightly to the left, hit the localizer antenna for runway 06 when over an airport road and a cliff and impacted the airport perimeter wall. It was that fall from the end of the runway, which that terrain drops off rather abruptly, and I'll show you on a Google Street View picture, that caused the breakup of the aircraft, not necessarily the impact with the wall. METARs, this is the weather conditions at the time. At 05:15:20 Zulu, the winds are reported as 290 at 22 knots, gusting to 37 knots. He's landing with a tailwind. There's thunderstorms in the area and some broken clouds, but the visibility appears good under the clouds. Let's look at the landing app for this. If you're landing on runway 06 with the winds as reported, 290 at 22 knots, without even accounting for the gusts, you do the calculations on that on your headwind tailwind finder, you'll find that he's landing with a 14-knot tailwind. He's landing hot and long with a 14-knot tailwind. Remember, the maximum tailwind generally acceptable in the industry is 10 knots. Plus, he's landing on a wet runway. That means your ability to get stopped on that runway is greatly reduced. He's also got a 16-knot crosswind component. Now, if some of you 737 pilots have your actual runway landing distance calculator out, if you could crunch those numbers for the 737-800, it'd be interesting to get what the actual landing distance required would be for this aircraft with 177 folks on board and a reasonable fuel load for landing and a wet runway. Post that in the comment section below. I'd like to see that data. All I have is the 777 landing distance calculator. Here's the Jepson 20-9 page that shows the airport layout for pilots, the runway length of 9,843 feet, runway 06 to the left, with a runway heading, of course, 060, that's what the runway number means, and a touchdown elevation of 293 feet. This jives with the Google Maps, just under 2 miles of runway length. Runway taxiway Tango Foxtrot, the last 3,300 feet means he touched down right about here, the last 2/3 of the runway. The desirable landing spot is in the first 1/3 of the runway, shown in green here, and where all the rubber deposits are. Looking at those rubber deposits, it looks like runway 06 is used more than the opposite runway 24. There's approaches to runway 24. There's only a slight 11-foot difference in elevation between the two thresholds. I don't know why the runway 06 is the preferred runway at this airport. So I don't see anything glaringly obvious as to why the pilots wouldn't just turn around and use runway 24 and land into the wind. Here's what the terrain drop-off looks like off of the approach end of runway 24, where the aircraft fell and broke up, resulting in injuries. Based on the preliminary data, this appears to be a case of gross negligence on behalf of the crew that resulted in a terrible runway overrun. What was the compelling reason for the crew to accept a landing with that much tailwind on a wet runway? Why did they not go around? If you cannot land the aircraft in the first third of the runway, you must go around. This apparently is the second accident in less than a month for this particular airline at this particular runway. Which brings up the point that when you're flying overseas, especially on low-cost carriers overseas, you are fundamentally assuming a different level of safety than you would find in other parts of the world. Cultural differences, training differences, experience levels, language barriers, all this can result in a different level of safety as you travel throughout the world. And this is becoming apparent, and well, it's been well known within the industry for years, but it's becoming more known by the general population as we get through the Boeing 737 MAX saga and the retraining requirements for folks all around the world, and the acceptance of the 737 MAX by different local aviation governing agencies throughout the world. Again, this incident has nothing to do with the 737 MAX, and it has little to do with the 737 design, due to what appears to be the gross negligence of the crew. As we get more information, we'll post it here. See you here.